Most people think boundary testing is obvious. Someone asks for too much, you say no, done. But that's not how it actually works. If you've been told you care too much, or you're too nice, you've probably failed these tests dozens of times without even realizing they were happening. People don't test your boundaries by asking for huge things right away. That would be too noticeable. Instead, they run small, repeating patterns that feel totally normal until you step back and see what's actually going on. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. I started paying attention to this a few years ago when I realized I was constantly doing things I didn't want to do, yet I could never point to a moment when someone pressured me. There was no big confrontation, no guilt trip I could call out, just a slow drift into always being available, always saying yes, always being the one who adjusted. So I started watching for it, and what I found was that people were testing me all the time, not necessarily maliciously, just the way humans naturally do. They push until they find resistance, and if they don't find any, they keep pushing. I'm going to walk you through the 5 most common patterns people use to test whether you'll actually hold a line. These aren't theories. They're the exact things I watched happen over and over once I knew what to look for. The repeat request pattern. The first one is what I call the repeat request. This is when someone asks you for the same small thing multiple times, not because they forgot or actually need it each time. It's because they're testing whether you'll ever say no. Here's how it usually plays out. Someone asks you for a small favor. You do it. Totally reasonable. A week later, the same ask. You do it again. Then it happens a 3rd time, and by then it's just become something you do for them. Underneath, they're mapping your threshold. They're learning that you don't set a stopping point. I noticed this with a coworker who kept asking me to cover the last 20 minutes of her shift so she could leave early. The first time made sense. She had an appointment. The second time was less clear, but fine. By the 5th time, there was no reason. She was just leaving early because I hadn't said no yet. The wild part is she wasn't being manipulative in a calculated way. She was just doing what worked. The test isn't the first request. The first request is usually fine. The test is whether you'll notice the pattern and interrupt it. If you don't, you're teaching that person they can keep coming back to this well forever, and they will, because you've shown them there's no limit. The move here isn't to retroactively get mad about the past 5 times. That just makes you look unstable. The move is to notice the pattern and calmly stop it the next time. I've helped out a bunch of times, so I'm going to sit this one out. That's it. No justification. No apology. You're just closing the loop. And what happens after that tells you everything. If they react like it's a reasonable thing to say, great. If they act confused or hurt that you're not doing the thing you've always done, that's confirmation that they were relying on your lack of boundaries, not on your generosity. That pattern is common, but this next one is even more invisible, the response time test. People are tracking how fast you respond to them. They use that information to gauge how available you are, how much of a priority they are to you, and whether you'll drop things when they need something. This one took me a while to notice, because it doesn't feel like a test. It just feels like normal communication. But here's the thing, when you respond to someone within minutes every time, you're training them to expect that. Once they expect it, a delayed response feels like something's wrong. I had a friend who would text me random stuff throughout the day. Because I worked from home and had my phone nearby, I'd usually respond pretty quickly. No big deal. But then I started noticing that if I didn't respond within an hour, I'd get a follow-up. You good? Or, did you see this? It wasn't an emergency. She had just gotten used to me being instantly available, so anything else felt like a deviation. The test is whether you've set a precedent of constant availability. If you have, that becomes the baseline. Now you're not being helpful by responding fast, you're being slow if you don't. Here's what I started doing. I added a buffer. Even if I saw the message, I'd wait a bit before responding, especially if it wasn't urgent. Not to play games, just to reset the expectation that I'm not always on call. And you know what happened? Nothing bad. People just adjusted. They stopped expecting instant responses because I stopped training them to. The bigger point here is that people will take as much of your time and attention as you're willing to give, and they'll measure that by your behavior, not by what you say. You can tell someone, I'm really busy, all you want. But if you're still replying in 3 minutes, they know you're available. If you've noticed either of those, this next one is going to click a lot of things into place. The emotional escalation ladder. This is probably the one that messed with me the most once I saw it. People test which emotional tone gets you to do what they want. They do this by cycling through different approaches until they find the one that works. It usually goes like this. They ask you for something in a totally normal, calm way. If that doesn't work, they try again with a little bit of frustration in their voice. If that doesn't work, they add guilt. And whichever one gets you to fold, that's the one they'll use next time. I watched this happen with a family member who wanted me to come to a thing I didn't want to go to. First ask, casual, no pressure. I deflected. Second ask, a slight edge of annoyance, like I was being difficult. I held. Third ask, a full guilt trip about how I never make time for family and how much it would mean to them. I caved. And guess what? Next time they wanted something, they skipped straight to the guilt because they'd already learned that's the unlock code. The thing is, most people don't do this consciously. They're not sitting there thinking, let me try guilt next. They're just naturally escalating until something works, and then they remember what worked. But the result is the same. They've tested your boundaries and found the emotional frequency that gets through. The way out is to notice the pattern and not reward the escalation. If someone goes from calm to guilt trippy, and that's when you finally say yes, you've just taught them that guilt works. So if you're going to say yes to the calm ask. If the answer is no, keep it no throughout the whole ladder. That way, you're not training them that emotional pressure is the key. That one's about tone, but this next pattern is about the ask itself, the assumed yes. Some people don't ask you for permission. They ask in a way that assumes you've already said yes. If you don't correct them, you've confirmed that assumption. This looks like, I'll swing by around 7 instead of can I come over? Or, I'm putting you down for the volunteer shift on Saturday, instead of, are you available Saturday? The request is phrased as a done deal, and now the burden is on you to object. And here's why it works. Most people don't want to be the person who derails a plan that's already in motion. It feels awkward. It feels like you're being difficult. So you just go along with it, even though you never actually agreed. I used to have a roommate who did this constantly. I told my friends we'd host on Friday, instead of can we host on Friday? Because it was already framed as settled, saying no felt like I was uninviting people, which is way harder than just saying no to a question. The test here is whether you'll let someone else make decisions for you, as long as they phrase it confidently enough. If you don't push back, you've shown them they don't need to actually ask. They can just tell you what's happening, and you'll go with it. The fix is pretty simple but uncomfortable. You have to be willing to rewind the assumption. Wait, I didn't agree to that. Or, let's back up. I'm not available Saturday. It feels a little confrontational because you're interrupting their frame, but that's kind of the point. You're restoring the part where they actually need your agreement. And this last one is more strategic than the others, the favor sandwich. This is when someone builds momentum by getting you to say yes to small things, then drops the real request once you're already in yes mode. It works like this. Small favor, you say yes. Another small favor a few days later, you say yes. Then the big ask. Because you've already said yes twice, saying no now feels inconsistent. You've established a pattern, and breaking it can feel like being weird or withholding. I saw this clearly with someone who asked me to proofread a short email. Fine. Then asked for feedback on a one-pager. Sure. Then asked if I'd edit a full 30-page document over the weekend. The way they asked made it sound like this was just the next step in what we'd been doing. The test is whether you'll confuse a pattern of small yeses with an obligation to say yes to everything. If you do, they've learned they can get you to agree to bigger things as long as they build up to it. The way to handle this is to treat every ask as its own decision, not a continuation of past decisions. Just because you helped with something small doesn't mean you're locked into helping with something big. You can say, I could do the first couple of things because they were quick, but this one's outside what I've got bandwidth for. And if someone acts surprised or hurt by that, they were counting on you not drawing that line. One thing I realized while figuring all this out is that most boundary advice focuses on what to do in the moment. How to say no, how to stand firm, all of that. But the much harder part is recognizing that you're being tested in the first place, because these patterns are designed not to feel like tests. I kept a notes file on my phone where I'd write down patterns I noticed with specific people, and that made everything way more obvious. If you're someone who feels like you're always doing things you don't want to do but can't figure out how it keeps happening, tracking it for a week will show you exactly where the gaps are. So here's what we covered. The repeat request people asking for the same thing over and over to see if you'll ever stop them. The response time test training you into constant availability by measuring how fast you reply. The emotional escalation ladder cycling through different tones until they find the one that makes you fold. The assumed yes phrasing things as if they're already decided, so you have to object instead of declining. And the favor sandwich building yes momentum with small asks before dropping the real one. The common thread in all of these is that they work because they don't feel like boundary violations in the moment. They feel like normal interactions. And that's the point. People test your boundaries in ways that are just subtle enough that you won't call them out. And if you don't call them out, you've passed the test by failing it. Once you know the patterns, you'll start seeing them everywhere. And the good news is you don't need to have some big confrontation or completely reset every relationship. You just need to start noticing when the test is happening and calmly interrupt the pattern. That's it. Most people will adjust without you ever needing to explain what you're doing. And the ones who don't adjust, the ones who react badly, when you stop being endlessly available, those people were never respecting your boundaries in the first place. They were just benefiting from the fact that you didn't have any.